The events began on December 10th in Seoul. It was an ordinary man named Cha Dong-hwan. He had a girlfriend who considered him a good person but good for everyone. This, along with his job, led to the end of their relationship. It didn't matter who Cha Dong-hwan was with. If a call came from his unit, he would immediately head out on a mission. He worked as a firefighter. Why did he work? Because he had been fired from that job. Cha Dong-hwan was a very responsible worker and wanted nothing more than to save every life. Sometimes this sense of justice drove him to extremes, and he did not always think things through. His boss supported his actions, as the driver had parked in the wrong place, and it would take too long to go around. Although his boss respected him, the idiot's father in the foreign car owned the K newspaper, so they had big problems. Cha Dong-hwan thought he was being fired, but instead, he was ordered to go to Antarctica for his dedicated service. When winter began there, it became impossible to travel by any means, so security personnel were sent there. Thus, the boss wanted Cha Dong-hwan to keep his job, as the fuss would settle down during his assignment. It seemed that this was where everything should have ended, but the most interesting part began right there. Polar night, frozen lands, strong winds, in the midst of one of the most terrible trials. They looked into the eyes of the devil. You did not miss here, it was indeed the devil. Who would have thought that the phrase rescue service would take on an entirely different meaning in Antarctica? But more on that later. On April 12th, news was being filmed about the approaching winter in Antarctica and the polar night that lasted 6 months. The average temperature was minus 50 degrees Celsius. 3 countries were working at the base: China, Japan, and Korea. Leadership changed it every year, and this time it was China. 3 days passed. Cha Dong-hwan was on a plane. To get to Antarctica, several transfers had to be made in different corners of the world. He sat next to a man who immediately recognized him as a firefighter. For the neighbor, this was his second trip. It seemed he was more interested in the journey, so he did not stop talking for a second. Cha Dong-hwan was very kind, so he could not refuse even though the flight lasted a whole day. Meanwhile, it had already grown dark. Although Cha Dong-hwan was already asleep, the neighbor still did not stop and shared a bunch of facts about Antarctica. He thought he would soon lose this talkative neighbor. Suddenly, the announcement for landing was made, and Cha Dong-hwan could finally exhale. They landed late at night. The Secretary General announced good news that they were lucky with the weather and Chilean aviation would take them to the base instead of by ship. There was a little time before departure, so everyone was sent to rest. Suddenly, Cha Dong-hwan asked the Secretary General to change his seat. Meanwhile, a new day had already begun. The expedition was greeted by beautiful weather and cute little animals. The plane was landing at the base. Inside, the rest of the expedition members from other countries were already busy. To survive in such conditions, good physical preparation was necessary. At that moment, a man walked in. He said in Chinese that the Koreans had just arrived. The athlete immediately stopped his training upon hearing this news. He ordered the man to gather everyone at the entrance, except for those with important matters, to welcome the newcomers. While everyone was unloading and exiting the plane, it was time to get to know the expedition group from China. Communications Officer Jin Yun, Engineer Sima Jing, Meteorologist Sun Qing, Security Officer Wang Gaochang, and Cosmologist Li Meilin. The captain greeted them in English. One of the Korean team's press secretaries, Se Hyung, already knew Captain Lee Si-kwon. They greeted each other and shook hands. The captain told his team not to stand around and help the Koreans with their luggage. The Japanese group was expected to arrive the next day, weather permitting. Lee Si-kwon said that the day was still divided into day and night, but the day was getting shorter, so winter was near. In the morning, they planned a tour of the base, and for now, the Koreans could unpack and rest. Some also knew Lee Si-kwon, as he was a well-known astronaut and had even gone into space. He was also a famous researcher in China, China, having visited 5 oceans and 6 continents. Eventually, he went to space. Such experience made others admire him. Cha Dong-hwan overheard this conversation and was glad that his neighbor had found willing ears. Suddenly, Li Meilin approached him to greet him. He was surprised that she knew Korean. She introduced herself, to which Cha Dong-hwan rather rudely asked what of it. Li Meilin did not back down, saying she loved Korean dramas, so she learned a little of the language. But this did not impress Cha Dong-hwan, so she asked for his name. The man simply exhaled aggressively. Li Meilin said she just wanted to be friendly. Then Cha Dong-hwan said that in that case, she should take this and leave quickly, to which Li Meilin replied that they should speak slower because it was still hard for her. Cha Dong-hwan switched to English and told Lee Mei-lin that she should be quieter and leave quickly, as constant chatter on the way nearly drove him mad. But she did not understand this either, saying it was too fast for her and she spoke English poorly. Cha Dong-hwan raised his voice when suddenly Wang Gao-chang intervened, saying that Lady Lee was not engaged in physical labor. It turned out that she was the daughter of the head of Hwanho Group, the main sponsor of this base, so she was not a participant but a distinguished guest. Cha Dong-hwan said that this did not concern him, to which he was told it would concern him. The man exchanged aggressive glances. Tension was immediately felt between them. Lee Mei-lin asked Wang Gao-chung what Cha Dong-hwan had said, and Lee Si-kwan had lied to her. He had lied to her. She did not believe him. But there was no choice, so she became sweet again. And Wang Gao-chung quickly decided to take her away from the rude Cha Dong-hwan. Meanwhile, a new day dawned after a difficult night. Communications officer Jin Yoon sat in his place, drinking morning coffee. Suddenly, he was spoken to in English over the radio. He immediately decided it was the Japanese team. It turned out they had an emergency situation and needed help. This puzzled Jin Yoon. Meanwhile, Cha Dong-hwan was resting in his room, when all units were ordered to gather at the entrance in 3 minutes over the radio. As always, angry Cha Dong-hwan was outraged that he hadn't rested. At the meeting, they reported an emergency situation with the Japanese team. The captain said that due to the weather, they had landed 300 kilometers from them and had gotten caught in a blizzard. The Secretary General said that they probably had damaged transport if they were asking for help. But it was also possible that the team was buried in an avalanche or fell off a cliff. The captain said they were about 30 kilometers away from them. The Secretary General said it was not that far and asked Dong-hwan what he thought. He replied that they needed to rescue the people as quickly as possible first. They would need snowmobiles and minimal equipment. The Secretary General asked how many people he needed. Cha Dong-hwan said 3 would be enough. Then he was ordered to gather equipment while the Secretary General would select the personnel. Cha Dong-hwan turned to Mr. Wang, telling him to take the equipment and go with him, as he had experience in winter rescue operations. But Wang Gao-chung refused. Cha Dong-hwan was surprised, as he was responsible for security, to which Wang replied that his first task was to protect Miss Lee. Therefore, he would never leave her, especially not take her to a dangerous place. Cha Dong-hwan switched into rescue mode and told Wang Gao-chung that 25 people were waiting for salvation in such cold. He was very angry and asked if Wang Gao-chung understood what was more important, to which he replied that he perfectly understood that Miss Lee was more important. Cha Dong-hwan was very furious. Then someone else intervened. Lee Si-kwan told Wang Gao-chung that if he wasn't going to help, he at least shouldn't hinder. After which, the captain told Cha Dong-hwan that he would personally go to the disaster site. He simply remained silent. Meanwhile, a team of 5 people set off for the rescue. Communications officer Jin Yoon grabbed the radio to contact the Japanese group. He asked for the coordinates to be clarified as they were almost at the site. The Japanese team was near a cliff with overturned vehicles, and part of the equipment had fallen into the cliff itself. One of them, who was speaking with communications officer Jin Yoon, told the team that the rescuers would arrive soon. At that moment, the sound of snowmobile engines was heard. The communications officer of the Japanese team was named Susumu Izobe. He was communicating with the captain. He briefly explained what had happened as time was running out. It turned out that when they switched to vehicles to reach the base, a strong blizzard began on the way. They continued moving when suddenly, a huge avalanche collapsed in front of them. Susumu Izobe panicked, but immediately contacted the rest of the crew to warn them about the avalanche. Suddenly, another collapse occurred. The vehicle could not withstand it and was swept away by the avalanche. The car was sharply overturned to the side from such an impact. The driver tried to steer but was not prepared for this. This had some effect, but the crew could still drown in the snow. The driver ordered everyone to hold on tight if they wanted to survive. At that moment, Susumu Isobe noticed something. At that moment, a rock was flying at them from the top of the mountain. He shouted to Hiroshi but was already mentally saying goodbye to life. Fortunately, the rock fell near the vehicle, but it still caused a lot of damage, throwing the passengers from side to side. The most terrifying thing was that the rock continued to fall toward the vehicle. Susumu Izobe had never experienced such fear in his life. His heart was racing from hopelessness and fear. He saw with his own eyes how a massive rock was flying straight at them at a terrifying speed. Hiroshi slammed on the brakes. The vehicle skidded to the side. The rock was a meter away from the vehicle, about to cause a severe fatal collision. Suddenly, the vehicle was overturned. She spun around a few times, after which she landed in deep snow. The landing was quite soft, but the crew's lives flashed before their eyes. They were a step away from death. Hiroshi tried to start the car, but nothing worked. Then he decided to get out and see what had happened. Susumu Asobi was trying to contact the others at that moment. Hiroshi realized that with such damage, the car couldn't be fixed on the spot, and reinforcements were needed. The radio was not working due to the strong impacts. Suddenly, the rest of the crew responded. Everyone was unharmed, no one was injured. Therefore, Susumu Isobe decided it was best to split up into vehicles and reach the base, leaving the car for later. At that moment, a large bus was driving behind them, along with another vehicle. Susumu Isobe waved to them to signal a stop. But the bus did not stop. Instead, it accelerated in the opposite direction. Suddenly, it tipped over and crashed hard into a pile of snow, after which the bus simply sank down. The crew immediately ran to save their team. No one even noticed that there was a chasm there. The bus was clearly wedged between two cliffs and fortunately did not fall further down. Most likely they had veered off the safe route due to an avalanche without even realizing it. Susumu Isobe tried to contact the bus crew, but through the echo, he could hear that no one was responding. His heart raced wildly. For a moment, he even lost hope and faith. Hiroshi felt this and told his partner not to count the team out too soon, as Dr. Nozomi-san was with them. Hiroshi added that their radio had simply broken, and it was crucial to get the crew out now. Suddenly, Susumu Isobe jumped up and ran. He said the base was not far, and he would call for help. Captain Lee Sequan silently listened to the entire story, after which he asked if they had tried to shout for help after losing contact. Of course they had tried, but the blizzard muffled all sounds. The captain was told that descending by rope was too dangerous and that they should wait for equipment. To which Susumu Isobe replied that there were injured people. He was being told that the bus was in a very unstable position and any shift in the center of gravity could lead to disaster. The captain simply remained silent and listened. Meanwhile, some did not waste time and gathered all the necessary equipment. It was Cha Dongwan. He said he would go alone. The captain was sincerely surprised by such an act, but the firefighter explained that there was a snowstorm, and if they did not hurry, the bus would be buried under the snow. And if their heater had broken after the fall, the entire crew would soon turn to ice. Cha Dongwan approached the edge and said that if the avalanche came down again, it would be the end. The captain added that for the firefighter, this could be a very great danger. To which Cha Dongwan replied that he had an idea. Susumu Isobe said there were 15 people, and the firefighter ironically responded that it was only the first day here, and they were already stuck like this. But there was no choice. Someone had to save those people. Cha Dongwan prepared to descend, but at the last moment the captain stopped him and asked him to take care of himself. To which Cha Dongwan, as usual, just scoffed and began to descend. Everything was fine, until Cha Dongwan's foot suddenly slipped, but he managed to grab onto a rock, escaping with just a slight scare. The captain immediately contacted him, but Cha Dongwan said he was acting according to plan. Meanwhile, the firefighter was almost at the bus. Inside, the crew was just coming to their senses. Everyone was cautiously getting to their feet and trying to contact their people. But the radio was completely broken. Masaki Nakata told Commander Sayaki Kozakura that they had no means of communication with the crew. There were no other devices, so the captain began to panic, thinking that their end had come. The rest of the crew also began to express their outrage, saying that nothing like this had ever happened to them in their lives. Diamond Sawamura was outraged that he was just a regular chef, and this was how his life ended. Masaki Nakata ordered everyone not to panic, as he was sure their team had already called for help. He asked Dr. Nozomi how things were with them. It turned out there were injuries, and although the bleeding had stopped, the body temperature continued to drop. The heater was also broken. It was dangerous to keep the patient in such a state. Polar zoologist Ryu Kanoshita looked very pale, but held on until the end. The captain could no longer keep himself together. All that remained was to hope for rescue, and rescue was already close. Cha Dongwan said over the radio that he was on site and ordered the ladder to be lowered. Equipment flew down from above. Now Cha Dongwan had to deal with the doors, but they were completely blocked, complicating the situation. He decided to break the windshield, but immediately changed his mind. First, he decided to tap on the glass. The crew immediately reacted, thinking rescuers had arrived. Cha Dongwan swung his equipment, after which, with a light flick of his hand, he shattered the glass. He introduced himself to the crew as a rescuer and asked if everything was all right. A doctor spoke to him, saying that one person was injured, but the rest were fine. Cha Dongwan immediately realized that evacuating the patient with a penetrating wound would take a lot of time, and they might not make it to save the others. So he contacted the crew and said that one person was severely injured, and at his signal, they should lower the stretcher. He would first send all the survivors. After which, he extended a hand of assistance and said that those who could walk on their own should go first. Nozomi-san said she was a doctor, so she would go last. Cha Dongwan didn't care if that was her wish. Meanwhile, things were progressing, and people were slowly making their way up. Cha Dongwan secured everyone for safety and sent them up. Suddenly, the bus creaked loudly and began to sink. Inside were the doctor and the injured, who barely held on. Even the chef was shaken, but Cha Dongwan held him steady. Diamond Sawamura even began to stutter, but thanked him for saving him. Meanwhile, Cha Dongwan thought everything was moving too slowly, and the bus would soon just fall down. So he ordered the captain to lower the stretcher. And Cha Dongwan ordered the doctor to get out quickly, although she resisted because she wanted to be the last. The firefighter raised his voice, trying to explain that there was no time to argue. Nozomi-san stood her ground, saying she could not leave that patient alone. Cha Dongwan resorted to cursing but spoke in Korean so that he wouldn't be understood. Meanwhile, the stretcher was lowered, and he had no choice but to retrieve the injured person first. When he was placed, Cha Dongwan ordered to raise the patient. Now only one person remained, and that would be enro. And so I mentioned that would be the end of it. The rescuer descended to retrieve Nozomi-san. Suddenly the bus creaked, which meant only one thing, that it began to sink down. Cha Dongwan tried to hold on to his rope. Nozomi-san was very frightened, as the bus had never sunk this much before. She flew to the end of the vehicle, and could have broken the glass with her body and fallen out of the bus entirely. Then she would have had no chance of survival at all. Cha Dongwan gritted his teeth and just tried to hold on to the rope and the safety gear he had. But the bus was simply plummeting down at high speed. Dr. Nozomi-san was falling down with the bus and was already saying goodbye to her life. Suddenly, the bus began to creak again as it caught on the rock wall. Nozomi-san hit the glass and it cracked but did not shatter. Cha Dongwan survived, simply hanging on the rope. And the bus sank several meters down. It was much lower now. The rescuer was catching his breath, trying to come to terms with the horror he had just experienced. Nozomi-san also realized what had just happened. Her heart was racing wildly, as she was a step away from death. If the glass shattered, she would not survive. Although Cha Dongwan had no choice but to descend and save Nozomi, but the further he descended, the worse it became. Finally, he reached the bus. Nozomi-san was unharmed and could even speak. He shouted for the doctor not to move. As the glass was too unstable and with a single movement, Nozomi could fall through. Cha Dongwan ordered her to stay still and not to jerk around. He would come to help. He understood that in this situation, if he quickly penetrated the bus, the glass might not withstand and shatter. But what was he to do then? He did not know himself. Only one pneumatic drive could let him down. Cha Dongwan, as always, had no choice but to try. He asked Nozomi-san if she could hear him, after which he asked if she could press the door opening button. But she did not know which one was necessary. Cha Dongwan explained that next to the handbrake there should be a picture of the door. Nozomi-san found it, but she reminded him that she had been told not to move, but Cha Dongwan explained that one step would not be critical, as there was no other way out. Nozomi-san prepared to take a step, but then she said she couldn't, her body wouldn't move. She was trembling all over. Cha Dongwan told her that she could do it, she just had to do it. Nozomi-san broke into tears, saying she couldn't. The firefighter cursed again, as this doctor was giving her too many problems. She realized she was being scolded even in Korean. Cha Dongwan did not deny it, saying that when she was safe, she could scold him as much as she wanted. She was trembling all over and thought she would not succeed. But still, she took a slow step forward. She reached for the door opening buttons. Cha Dongwan prayed that the doors would actually open. Otherwise, all efforts would be in vain. And it happened. The doors opened. Nozomi-san screamed with joy. She couldn't believe she had actually done it. Cha Dongwan threw her the rope and ordered her to throw it around herself and pull it under her arms, after which she was to slowly exit the bus. Nozomi-san wanted to argue about something, but she didn't have time to say anything, as Cha Dongwan interrupted her, shouting that she would survive even if she fell. Nozomi shouted back, asking why he was so angry, to which Cha Dongwan replied that if the bus fell, they would both die, so she needed to bring her butt over here immediately. Then Nozomi-san pulled herself together and threw the rope. She took her first steps, cursing quite a bit in the process. The glass cracked. Cha Dongwon understood that it would soon give way, but he was ready for it. Suddenly, Nozomi-san began to scream loudly because the glass had collapsed, and she felt like she was falling down. Cha Dongwon yanked the rope sharply towards himself, after which he yelled at her to stop screaming because she was still alive. Nozomi-san opened her eyes and began to come to her senses. She saw that she hadn't actually fallen. Cha Dongwon had saved her. Meanwhile, Nozomi-san and Cha Dongwon finally escaped from that nightmare. The doctor immediately asked where Ryu Kinoshita, her patient, was. Susumu Isube said that he had been taken to the base as soon as they got him out. Nozomi-san could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Susumu Isube told her that she needed to remember to take care of herself, even if she was a doctor. But then he said he was glad she had survived. The captain praised Cha Dongwon for a job well done, to which he replied that it was just part of the job for him. The firefighter lit a lighter to smoke. Suddenly, everything shook and fell apart. Apparently, the bus had fallen down. Cha Dongwon tried not to show it, but he was actually very nervous. He even had to light up. The captain saw through him but didn't let on and said it was good that everyone had survived. And they finally all gathered to welcome winter. Meanwhile, the events shifted to the base. Ryu Kinoshita lay on the operating table where he was being treated. A vehicle was being repaired in the garage. The communicators were at work. The cooks were preparing in the kitchen. Everyone returned to their places, and Cha Dongwon decided to go rock climbing. At that moment, Captain Lee Sequan announced that everyone should gather at the entrance for a commemorative photo. Cha Dongwon barely held himself together. He was fed up with it all. He changed clothes and was about to head to the entrance when someone stopped him. It was Dr. Nozomi-san, who with a guilty look said she hadn't thanked him for saving her. Cha Dongwon stood in shock while the doctor apologized for her screams. He said it was fine, he had already forgotten about it. But Nozomi-san stood her ground and thanked Cha Dongwon in Korean. Cha Dongwon scoffed again and told her not to confuse him, to speak in English. After which he simply turned around and left, adding that Nozomi didn't need to thank him, as they were just doing their duty. Nozomi-san then called Cha Dongwon an irritating jerk in Japanese. Meanwhile, everyone went outside for a group photo. Cha Dongwon stood aside as usual when suddenly someone noticed him. It was that same talkative Korean. He immediately approached the firefighter with questions. Then he said he had smoked too much and his lungs were suffering. Captain Lee Sequan saved Cha Dongwon from a nervous breakdown. Everyone lined up by the entrance. Wang Gaochang said that this base was for cooperation among 3 countries, so he suggested mixing up and not separating by nationality. Thus, Cha Dongwon and Nozomi-san ended up together but pretended not to see each other. So Nozomi tried to find someone to talk to, and she did. Cha Dongwon scoffed at such feigned politeness. Meanwhile, the photographer was ready to take the shot. He ran to the others. There were only 5 seconds left. At that moment, Cha Dongwon did not know what horrors they would all soon face. April 27th arrived. The sunset that day was incredible. The radio announced that it was the last one, as there wouldn't be another like it for the next 4 months. April 27th officially marked the beginning of polar night. The next day would still be warm and sunny, but in a couple of days, the temperature would drop to 40 degrees below zero. There would also be a high likelihood of heavy snowfall, so they needed to be cautious. This was said by Kim Wante from the meteorology team. Even Cha Dongwon couldn't resist such a sunset. Meanwhile, the events shifted to the locker room. Ryu Kinoshita was asked how his leg was doing. It was better, but he was more concerned about whether he could spend the last day of filming without lighting at the base. Then they were told that a Chinese cosmologist wanted to join them for filming, and they couldn't refuse, as she was the daughter of the owner of Hwanho Group. Ryu Kinoshita smoothed things over while his friend complained about having to babysit. The events shifted to the street. Li Meiling was fascinated by the penguins, as if she were seeing them for the first time. Then she approached Ryu Kinoshita with a request and asked him to help her catch a penguin. She said it would be very cute, and she wanted to bring one to her room. Ryu Kinoshita said that was impossible and was shocked that she was so naive. Li Meiling was indignant, saying that there were many penguins and having one as a pet would be nice. Ryu Kinoshita tried to gently explain that there were rules against capturing animals unless it was for research purposes. Li Meiling pouted, saying in Chinese that she would ask her dad to buy her one later, while Kinoshita already worried about his fate. But Li Meiling didn't sulk for long and said that Ryu Kanoshita should help her take a picture with the animal in her arms. However, that was also prohibited because it was dangerous. Lee Mei-ling couldn't believe that these cute penguins could be dangerous. So Ryu Kanoshita gave her binoculars and told her to look for herself to learn everything. There she saw the penguin swimming in the water. Suddenly, someone peeked from behind. Lee Mei-ling joyfully exclaimed that a seal had come to play. Ryu Kanoshita corrected her, saying they were not seals but sea lions, and they hadn't come to play but were after the penguins. Just then, at that moment, a sea lion emerged from the water and grabbed a penguin. Lee Mei-ling's eyes widened in shock. Chaos erupted on the water as more sea lions appeared, leading to more victims. Ryu Kanoshita said that soon the king would appear. Lee Mei-ling didn't understand what he was talking about. The talk was about what lay at the bottom of the ocean, while the sea lions devoured the penguins. They became easy prey for the orcas. From what she saw, Lee Mei-ling was breathless. She was in shock from such brutality. Ryu Kanoshita said that Antarctica was not a tourist zone but a battlefield in the harshest environment on Earth. And the local animals were not cute. They were warriors surviving every day and every hour. Ryu Kanoshita asked the photographer if he had captured everything, after which he told everyone it was time to return as the sun was already setting. And ahead of them lay a very long night. At night, magic always happened. It lured with its mystery. But were all secrets worth uncovering? Perhaps some secrets were better left in the shadows. Meanwhile, 4 months passed. It was August 19th. At the base, everyone was either having lunch or dinner. No one had gotten used to the constant night in 4 months. One of them complained all the time, unable to get used to the darkness. He was told that in about 40 hours, they would be able to enjoy the sea a bit. Two friends were constantly arguing. They had studied together in college. Their partner said he envied them for working together. Then they yelled at him that they weren't friends. After the quarrel, they noticed Cha Dongwon, who was sitting alone again. He was always offered to sit with them. The Koreans were offended that their compatriot behaved this way, but they attributed it to introversion. One of them added that Cha Dongwon was a decent guy. He knew this because they often saw each other at the gym. And he wasn't as strange as everyone thought. Cha Dongwon just liked being alone. One of them suggested playing tennis, but everyone had work to do. It turned out that the Japanese were preparing for an expedition, but the vehicle and some equipment were broken, so they needed to take a look. All this time they hadn't bonded. Discomfort still lingered among the Asians. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the cooks were discussing Chun Ki-wook, who had missed lunch again. The chef defended him and ordered his partner to choose his words carefully. He replied that Chun Ki-wook wouldn't hear them anyway. The chef said they were cooks, and their job was to feed everyone delicious and healthy food. Meanwhile, Chun Ki-wook was in his lab. Strange things were happening. He was looking into a device and shouting with joy. He said he was now the best in history, acting like a madman when the chef walked in. When Chun Ki-wook saw the cook, he immediately moved his research aside as if it were treasure. And he asked what had happened aggressively. The chef sensed the aggressive mood and said it was him, Sawamura. Chun Ki-wook asked if he had been taught to knock, to which Sawamura replied that he had knocked, but Chun Ki-wook hadn't heard him. The mad scientist calmed down but ordered him to leave. But the cook didn't hurry to leave, as he had brought him food. Chun Ki-wook remained silent. So Sawamura left the food on the table and talked about the benefits of what he had prepared, adding that Chun Ki-wook looked terrible. Then the scientist thanked him and quickly ushered Sawamura out, asking him not to worry about him anymore. When the cook left, Chun Ki-wook gritted his teeth and said that this jerk wanted to steal his discovery. Sawamura exited with relief after such a tense atmosphere, but he still heard Chun Ki-wook's mad shouts that it was his research. But still, the scientist's food was tempting. Some time passed. In the kitchen, they were washing dishes. Suddenly, someone came to them, with careful, quiet steps, as if sneaking up. This someone shed their outer clothing. This person saw nothing and followed the scent like a mole. They reached the kitchen from which the cooks were just exiting. They found Chun Ki-wook there, who looked terrible. The chef asked what had happened to him and why he was naked. Chun Ki-wook said he was very naked. Sawamura was pleased that he had little porridge and said he would soon bring a bowl of hot rice with a side dish. The partner told the boss that lunch was over, but he ordered him to be quiet. Sawamura told Chun Ki-wook to sit somewhere and wait. But the scientist in a strange voice said that it was not that. The boss paid no attention and decided that Chun Ki-wook simply did not like rice, so he offered something else. Suddenly, Chun Ki-wook began to apologize, saying he was too hungry. His strange voice grew louder, which frightened the boss. Just then, someone's teeth sank into his hand. Chun Ki-wook lunged at the boss as if he were an animal. Savamura screamed in pain, as the scientist's teeth had suddenly become very sharp. Chun Ki-wook bit his hand until it bled and his eyes turned red. The others rushed to help the boss. They struck Chun Ki-wook in the stomach to make him back off. The scientist flew back and fell to the floor. The partners caught the boss and shouted at Chun Ki-wook that he had lost his mind. Suddenly, the scientist began to ask where he was and what kind of place this was, after which he screamed as if something was hurting him. The others stood in shock at a safe distance. Suddenly, Chun Ki-wook's hands began to twist in different directions, as if his bones were breaking. And then he lunged at the boss again. He tried to stop Chun Ki-wook, but the scientist suddenly became very strong, knocking Savamura off his feet. The other partners rushed to help again. They surrounded Chun Ki-wook from all sides to restrain his arms. Savamura stepped into the hallway to call for help. They arrived and asked what had happened to the boss's hand. He said that the Korean had lost his mind. Savamura was told to be careful with his words, but the boss immediately interrupted his lecture, saying there was no time for that. When they saw what was happening, there were no more objections. They did not understand what was going on, but they knew that Chun Ki-wook needed to be subdued. And after that, taken to the infirmary because the scientist had a high fever, he was burning up. The boss Savamura also needed to be taken there as he was injured, after which he removed his belt from his pants and tied Chun Ki-wook's legs so he wouldn't move, and also his arms and his head, as it was one of the most dangerous parts. And then they set off to the medical station when suddenly the boss said he was feeling hot. In the hospital, no one knew what to do. Nozomi-san decided that perhaps he had suddenly gone mad. Meanwhile, Maki was treating Savamura's wound. Nozomi-san decided to check the temperature first. She was warned that the patient had bitten. Fortunately, he was well restrained. But by Nozomi's expression, it was clear that something was wrong. The partner asked what had happened, but the doctor only replied that the thermometer was faulty and a new one was needed. In the meantime, Maki noticed something strange while bandaging Savamura's arm. She asked if he was okay. After all, she felt a strong fever in the patient. The boss said he was burning up, but Savamura said everything was fine and it was just a minor issue. Maki replied that she would tell Nozomi-san everything and she would prescribe treatment. Suddenly, Savamura's speech became very strange and slow. He turned to Maki and asked if she always looked so appetizing. The girl was frightened and outraged, saying it was sexual harassment, and she could never have imagined Savamura was that kind of person. Suddenly, the boss shouted that it was not harassment, and Maki really did look very delicious. The girl's heart seemed to stop for a second. She froze in shock, as after those words, she felt like prey. Savamura was behaving very strangely, as if he were breathing fire. Suddenly, he looked at Maki, and in that gaze, he made it clear that he was a predator. Maki stood in shock, her body not obeying her. Just then, Savamura roared loudly, like a beast. Nozomi-san heard these cries. They clearly indicated something terrible was happening. After all, an ordinary person could not roar like that. Nozomi peeked through the window to see what was happening in the office. Without thinking long, she burst into the office with shouts and outrage. But suddenly someone grabbed her by the arm. The cook stopped her, although Nozomi tried to protest. But the cook stood his ground, as Savamura had the same symptoms as Chun Ki-wook. Nozomi mentally listed all the symptoms and decided that it could not be so, as the incubation period was too short. Then another partner intervened and ordered them to stop talking and better just close the door and get out of there. He tried to prove that they had witnessed a murder and they needed to lock up the killer and report it to Captain Lee. The cook began shouting at Chin-chong, ordering him to shut his bad mouth. They started arguing with each other, accusing one another of racism. Suddenly, their argument was interrupted by Savamura, who emerged from the office and roared like a beast. Chin-chong immediately reacted and lunged at the killer with shouts. He swung and struck Savamura in the face. This only enraged the monster even more, and he roared very loudly and strongly, like a true beast. He lunged at Chin-chong and bit his arm, but he did not stop there and immediately lunged at another victim. The cook could not understand what was happening to the boss. Due to strong trust, he did not even think to fight back, believing that Savamura would recognize his friend and not harm him. The others stood in shock and horror. Suddenly, Maki emerged from the office, having been bitten by Savamura earlier. Dr. Nozomi-san told Saki-san that there was danger behind, but it was too late, as Maki managed to lunge at the poor fellow. She bit off a piece of his ear. Chaos ensued. Nozomi stood in shock when her partner ran to take her away. The doctor wanted to protest, but she was interrupted, being told that she could not handle it alone and needed help. At that moment, the Korean got up, who also transformed into a monster and asked if they were planning to go somewhere. He was outraged that the doctors had decided to abandon the patients, scolding them and accusing them of racism. Nozomi understood that Jin-Yun was also starting to change, so their situation was very dire. The monster said he was going to kill them all. Suddenly, the door opened. Cha Dong-won entered, saying he had heard screams from the hall. The monster commented that it was an unnecessary obstacle, after which he suddenly lunged at Cha Dong-won. But the firefighter did not even change his expression. He was not afraid at all. He simply grabbed the monster by the face with his bare hands, after which he abruptly threw his head. The monster crashed into the wall, his head smashed, and he fell down. But of course, this did not kill him, only enraged him even more. Cha Dong-hwan understood this and simply said that the monster had asked for it. He quickly and boldly grabbed his arm, after which he twisted both of the monster's arms behind its back, as if he were a prisoner. But the strength of this monster, Cha Dong-hwan did not understand. He wondered if Jin-Yun was still human. He could not be that strong. Then a nurse entered and warned Cha Dong-won to be careful, as all these people were not themselves. The firefighter sarcastically asked if she was really telling the truth and not joking. And at that moment, Maki lunged at her and knocked her to the ground. Cha Dong-won understood he had to do something, as helping people was his calling. He kicked Maki in the face with his free leg. She fell onto Jin-Yun. Thus, Cha Dong-won took down two monsters at once. He said he would listen to what happened later, but for now, they had to get out. Suddenly, the nurse felt a sharp pain in her body, and when she turned around, she saw the monster devouring her leg. She quickly pulled her leg away and struck the monster. Cha Dong-won asked what she was waiting for and ordered her to hurry. The monsters remained in that room. The nurse entered the ward, where the mad scientist who had first turned into a monster was. Cha Dong-won said it seemed everything was fine, so he ordered her to tell what had happened. But the nurse's leg, it was bleeding, although no one noticed. After the story, Cha Dong-won said it sounded like rabies. Nozomi suggested that the infection occurred through blood after the bite. The nurse asked how it was treated. Nozomi replied that theoretically the HDVC vaccine for rabies should work. But the nurse wanted more than that. She wanted to know if there was a definite treatment. But Nozomi could not be sure of that. Cha Dong-won said that in any case they had to report everything to the captains. Nozomi agreed, but the nurse had other plans. She said she wanted to stay and close the door because someone might accidentally enter the infirmary. Nozomi did not find this strange. The nurse actually had her own motives. She had seen the vaccine while cleaning the medicines, so she quietly slipped into the room when everyone left. When she was rummaging through the drawers, the nurse began to feel her temperature rising. She kept telling herself that under no circumstances would she become like them, those monsters. Suddenly, one of the vials slipped from her hands, and then she found the necessary vaccine. She drew it up and injected herself, after which she decided she was cured, lying contentedly. But why was she feeling so hot then? Meanwhile, the firefighter and the doctor arrived in the captain's office. He was surprised that even Nozomi had not experienced such symptoms. It resembled hydrophobia, but the symptoms were stronger and the incubation period too short. The captain was curious how Ki-wook-chun could have been infected, as he had been alone in the laboratory the whole time. Lee Si-kwan said they needed to go to the scientist in the laboratory immediately because the answer was there. He called Cha Dong-won to come with him. He also had to check on how the infected were doing, as captain. So they all headed downstairs. On the floor, Lee Si-kwan asked Nozomi. Those were the patients she spoke of. They were the people who walked down the corridor. Suddenly, they all emerged, even though Nozomi was sure they had locked away all the monsters. On the floor lay Engineer Sima-jin, seemingly the new victim of theirs. When the nurse saw that new people had arrived, she immediately roared like a monster. This signaled the rest, and they all pounced on the fresh blood. Lee Si-kuang ordered everyone to run. On their way, they encountered a man who was listening to music. Lee Si-kuang commanded him to flee, but through his headphones, he understood nothing. He stood in a daze, wondering why the others were in such a hurry. Thus, he became a victim of the monster. In this way, he bought time for the others. Meanwhile, Lee Mei-lin sat in her room laughing at a video. Someone knocked on her door. It was Wang Gaochang, bowing and bringing a snack. Mei-lin barely paid attention, simply telling him to put it on the table. Suddenly, Wang Gaochang heard screams that were not typical for the base. He told the lady that he wanted to go check what had happened. But Lee Mei-lin did not want to be distracted from her tablet and told him to do whatever he wanted, just not to touch her. He ordered her to lock the door after him and not to open it for anyone. Maylin finally turned her attention away from the tablet, saying he was scaring her. Wang Gaochang left, closing the door behind him. He understood that this was not just a scream, as such cries were made when there was a danger to life. Meanwhile, Li Siquang opened an empty room, and he called Nozomi to follow him. Nozomi-san rushed in. Behind them, monsters were chasing, just a few steps behind. Li Siquang quickly shut the door behind him. He did this just in time, as immediately after, the monsters began banging on the door. Li Siquang ordered Nozomi to be quiet. The monsters left. Now they were finally safe and could breathe. Nozomi wanted to get out of there, but the captain objected, saying they would head to the observatory to assess the situation. Nozomi, as always, protested, as the observatory was on the 4th floor, and it was very risky. But there was a dispatch center, and everyone at the base did not know what had happened, and they had to report. Then they had to inform the leadership about what had occurred. Meanwhile, Wang Gaochang reached the lower floors and greeted his partners. But he did not know that his partners had long since become monsters. One of them immediately lunged at Gaochang, but he managed to dodge. It was no wonder he was entrusted with guarding such a large area. However, the monster decided to attack again. This time, Wang Gaochang grabbed it by the arm and neck. He was also surprised by how much strength was in such a small woman. She opened her mouth to bite Gaochang. He barely held on. It seemed the monster would soon overpower him. Suddenly, her hand slipped away. But Wang Gaochang did not lose his composure. He struck the monster in the stomach with all his might, so hard that the creature flew back and slammed into the wall. Of course, this did not kill her. It only irritated her further. Wang Gaochang, sensing this mood, said the monster had asked for it, and then she lunged again. Wang Gaochang was genuinely surprised that even one of the best Chinese techniques did not take her down. But this did not stop him, as he still had many interesting tricks up his sleeve. He gathered all his strength and qi and struck the monster. This time the blow looked stronger. She was pushed back and fell hard to the ground. She even began to vomit blood. Among the vomit, Wang Gaochang clearly recognized human flesh. From this, he could conclude that she had eaten a person. While he thought the monster got back on her feet, Wang Gaochang now did not understand what kind of person was this strong. He did not know what to do next, but he definitely understood that he needed to return to Li Meilin immediately. Wang Gaochang told her that if she was human, he would kneel before her spirit and apologize. But if she was a monster, then he had nothing to worry about, and he simply lunged at the monster. He struck her in the head with his knee. The monster was furious but flew back, hitting the wall. Now Wang Gaochang could clearly hear the crunch of bones and even more blood. He was even curious if the monster would get back on her feet this time. But the monster no longer moved. Wang Gaochang immediately switched to another problem, Li Meilin. But suddenly, loud sounds were heard approaching the floor where Gaochang was. After that, a horde of monsters rushed in. And here Wang Gaochang realized that this was not the end, but only the beginning with that monster. They all suddenly and simultaneously pounced on him in a group. Wang Gaochang skillfully defended himself, but understood that these scoundrels seemed endless. They appeared to be infinite. But Wang Gaochang truly excelled in battle skills and felt like a fish in water. He even had time to think about Li Meilin and that he should return to her. So when the opportunity arose, Wang Gaochang quickly fled from that nightmare. Meanwhile, events shifted to the captain's office. They discussed the next course of action, and Nozomi said there should have been a duty officer in the dispatch center. But if he had not sounded the alarm yet, then he had either been harmed or did not know about the situation, so Nozomi suggested calling him. Li Siquang agreed that it was a great idea. He called the 4th floor. It rang. The ringing continued because there was no one in the dispatch center to pick up the phone. After all, everyone who had been there had long since suffered at the hands of the monsters. They had simply staged a raid there, leaving no one alive. They even smashed the phone that was ringing. Li Siquang said that no one answered. But this still did not mean they had suffered, although it raised suspicions. Therefore, the captain said they had to get there. He asked Nozomi if she was sure that the infection occurred through a bite. The doctor replied that for now it seemed the most obvious. Then Li Siquang concluded that they simply needed to avoid being bitten. He turned to Nozomi and said that no matter how feral they became, they still remained human, and human teeth could not bite through such thickness. Li Siquang got dressed, and the doctor followed suit, indignantly responding that it was better this way than sitting here alone. Moreover, she was just as much a member of the team. Then Li Siquang took a table and smashed it. From the fragments, he made them weapons. Now they were protected from bites, but their faces remained vulnerable. They put on gloves, and now they were ready to battle those scoundrels. Nozomi told the captain as a parting note that if she became a hindrance, he could go on without her. Lisa Kuang replied that she could do the same with him, after which the captain opened the door. Monsters were in the corridor. But there was no choice. Lisa Kuang signaled to run. The monsters noticed them and were already ready to attack. The captain told Nozomi not to look back and just run forward as fast as she could. Suddenly a monster appeared before her. It was her partner, Risan. But in reality, she was no longer her friend, as friends do not lunge and bite. Fortunately, Nozomi was fully covered in clothing, which saved her from Risan. Suddenly, the monster knocked her glove off her hand. Now Nozomi faced a real threat. Suddenly, a loud sound rang out, and Risan fell to the side. Lisa Kuang came to the doctor's aid and fended off the monster. Risan only became angrier. Now her target was Lisa Kuang. She bit the captain's jacket. But this did not distract him at all. He swung his stick and struck Risan in the leg with all his might. Lisa Kuang hit her with all his strength again and again. But this yielded no results. The monster clung to him tightly. Only when he yanked his arm hard did Risan let go. Lisa Kuang did not hesitate. He swung and kicked her with all his strength. Risan fell down the stairs and posed no threat for a while. Nozomi was in a daze. Lisa Kuang asked if she could get up. They exited the corridor. Lisa Kuang closed the door behind him. Suddenly, a monster's hand appeared there. It immediately grabbed Lisa Kuang by his clothing. Nozomi stood in a daze while the captain tried to shake off the monster. This time, the head chef lunged at him. Suddenly, someone struck him in the eye with a stick, piercing his head through. It was Nozomi. She had gathered herself, forgotten her fear, and saved Lisa Kuang. This worked well, and the monster simply fell back, after which the door closed. They gasped for breath and came to their senses after what had happened. But their happiness did not last long, as they had guests. A large horde of monsters was rushing toward them from the dispatch center. The monsters were much faster. They did not even have time to react. Just as one monster fell on Lisa Kuang from above. Although the captain tried to fend it off, the monsters were many times more and they were stronger. He knocked Lisa Kuang to the ground. The captain was a step away from death, the monster breathing in his face. But Lisa Kuang was not one to give up. He fought to the last. The other two lunged at his legs. They tore at Lisa Kuang's clothing with their teeth. Feathers and fluff scattered in all directions. The captain understood that he couldn't hold out like this for long. Suddenly, the monster hovering over his face flew to the side. Nozomi struck it. She knocked the monster away with a chair. This gave Lisa Kuang the motivation he needed, and he kicked the monster in the face. After which, another attacker hit him in the stomach. Suddenly, an idea came to the captain. He grabbed Nozomi and told her to run in that direction. Lisa Kuang shoved her through the door, but the monster was closing in on him. Then the captain slammed the door shut. He managed to protect himself at the last second, and the monster crashed against the glass. Now they were trapped in a glass room surrounded by monsters. But at least it provided some safety and a chance to catch their breath and decide what to do next. Even though the monster was trying to break the glass, Lisa Kuang told Nozomi not to worry, as it was bulletproof glass. And just after those words, the glass cracked. The captain said that it was obvious the monsters were stronger. Meanwhile, on the lower floor, a real massacre was taking place. Blood was everywhere. Wang Gaochang stood, catching his breath after a tough battle. His face was covered in blood, and his gaze was weary. He told the monsters that they were to blame and should not have gone against him. After catching his breath, Wang Gaochang could return to business. Time was running out. He had to protect Li Meilin. And meanwhile, she sat in her room trembling with fear. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. When she heard the familiar voice of Gaochang, she immediately ran to open the door. But when she saw Wang Gaochang, her breath caught in her throat from fear. Her legs turned to jelly. Gaochang told her not to worry, but there were problems. Li Meilin began to cry, saying she had heard all the screams and battles. Wang Gaochang hugged her, promising that no one would even touch her. Li Meilin wanted to know how it had come to this, but there was no information. But Wang Gaochang knew for sure that it was dangerous to stay here. He said there was an emergency evacuation zone near the main building, and it should be safe there. Wang Gaochang gave Li Meilin some clothes, instructing her to dress warmly. He promised that it was for her safety. When everything was ready, they could set off. Wang Gaochang told Li Meilin to move as quietly as possible and to run to the evacuation zone at his signal. not to help anyone, not even him. Li Meilin accepted all the commands. Then Wang Gaochang opened the door, and their rescue operation began. The corridor was clear, but after they had gone a little further, a horror of blood began, but surprisingly all the monsters had disappeared. Wang Gaochang felt that something was wrong, as everything was going too well. He led the way, carefully listening to every sound. They reached the stairs and began to descend. Wang Gaochang heard footsteps and determined by the sound that it was a man. He ordered Li Meilin to stay behind. He tightened his grip on the axe and prepared himself. Then he suddenly swung at the one who was approaching. It turned out to be a person. He covered his face with his hands and begged not to be killed. But Wang Gaochang did not understand his language. He asked in English if the man had not gone mad. Wang Gaochang was also asked in return if he was sure he was healthy. Li Meilin recognized Xingquan, and Gaochang ordered her not to approach the newcomer. He demanded explanations from Xingquan about what was happening. He spoke very poorly in English, trying to explain in Korean, but they did not understand him. It was very dangerous downstairs. Then Xingquan said in short sentences that they couldn't go down because everyone had lost their minds. Wang Gaochang realized that his partner was very anxious and ordered him to calm down and explain everything in order. Xingquan could finally exhale as he no longer felt any danger from Gaochang. He explained that after lunch, he had been looking for someone to play tennis with. Suddenly, he saw someone. Satoshi was passing by. He suggested playing a match of Korea-Japan. But Satoshi did not like the expression Korea-Japan, even though they had often played tennis before. Suddenly, a sly smile appeared on his face, and Satoshi said it would be more correct the other way around. Xingquan understood his friend's mood, and they began a fierce battle. The score was 11-9 in favor of Korea. Xingquan started joking that at the Olympics in Korea, there were also more medals than in Japan. But it seemed to offend Satoshi. Xingquan tried to apologize, but Satoshi simply walked away. Then Xingquan called him a Korean-Japanese piece of crap. He did not think that Satoshi would understand everything. He got angry as he clearly understood that he had just been insulted. Xingquan tried to pretend to be a fool and prove that Satoshi had misunderstood everything. He attempted to explain and twist his words. But Satoshi did not want to hear it. He just left, saying he had no desire to talk. Xingquan ran after his friend when suddenly they stumbled upon monsters. They were devouring their partner. Xingquan's heart sank at the sight. The monsters immediately reacted to the fresh flesh, and they lunged at them. The friends began to flee, screaming. They burst into the corridor. But it turned out to be a dead end, and now they were finished. Satoshi tried to talk to the monsters and negotiate. Xingquan panicked. His heart raced with fear and the thoughts that overwhelmed his mind. He took a gulp, gathered his strength, and suddenly called out to Satoshi, who was not happy to talk to him. Xingquan apologized to Satoshi and shoved him. The Japanese couldn't believe it. Just moments ago, he had been treacherously betrayed and thrown face-first into death. The monster was just happy to feast on fresh flesh. After that, there were screams. A lot of screams. Xingquan seized the moment and carefully crawled along the wall, after which he began to run. But at the last moment, he decided to look back. He saw the expression on Satoshi's face. In his eyes was the question, why? And tears flowed. Xingquan would forever remember his face. The Korean's hands trembled. He said that the monsters had grabbed Satoshi, and he couldn't help because he was unarmed and unskilled. Xingquan asked what the plan was and begged to take him with them regardless. But Wang Gaochang refused, saying he didn't have the strength to protect two people at once. Li Meilin intervened, saying that Xingquan should go with them. Wang Gaochang could not contradict the lady, and he explained that they were heading to the evacuation zone and allowed Xingquan to follow them. The boy was glad, but told Gaochang to go first. After all, if the opportunity arose again, Xingquan would betray them too. Li Meilin asked what he had said before. After all, she had heard Xingquan say something about murder, death. He lied, saying he had barely escaped death, and asked if Meilin was sure of her Korean knowledge. The lady believed him, while Xingquan thought that this piece of crap had barely managed to fool him. Meanwhile, events shifted to the laboratory where Chung Ki-wook was. There, Cha Dongwon was searching for answers. He gathered some things, thinking it would be enough. The next step was to take everything to the captain, and he would sort it out himself. When he stepped into the corridor, he suddenly stopped. He had a bad feeling, just like back then. In his life, Cha Dongwon had experienced a lot and trusted his instincts. On the stairs, he saw a lot of blood and signs of a struggle, but he did not see any shells or bodies, so he understood that this was the work of those lunatics. Suddenly, a body appeared behind him. It was approaching Cha Dongwan. The boy calmly told the attacker that he was mistaken and that he was not a lunatic. It was the Secretary General, and he was in a stupor. How did Cha Dongwan realize it was him? The firefighter explained that one didn't need to have eyes in the back of their head to notice the Secretary General. Cha Dongwan said that by sound he could easily tell who was where and in what numbers. The Secretary General had no doubts about that, after which he asked what was happening, but Cha Dongwan did not understand anything himself. The Secretary General said he was heading to the observatory. After all, there was a communication center there. Many did not know about the danger, and the Secretary General wanted to warn them. Cha Dongwan wanted to go with him. The Secretary General was more than happy. Meanwhile, up top, true horror was unfolding. Monsters were breaking into the doctor and the captain. All the monsters were breaking in at once. Lisa Kuang told Nozomi to find something that could help them. He himself found something. There was a chair and a camera, but that was enough for him to make a weapon. Nozomi doubted this idea, especially when a monster was smashing its head against them, and it didn't even seem to be getting hurt. Nozomi decided that it was the end for them, but the captain shouted that he had succeeded. He opened the door and lunged at the monster. The monster lunged in response. Lee Sikwon held a glimmering camera in his hand. It turned out to be a stun gun that shocked the monster. And it worked. The monster fell, powerless and unconscious. But behind it was another scoundrel, eager to get fried. Lee Sikwon treated it to a jolt of electricity. The monster collapsed, even its hair scattered. Lee Sikwon could finally exhale. Nozomi was in shock, unable to believe that the captain had made a stun gun. After that, Lee Sikwon grabbed the monsters, stating that they were not dead, just temporarily incapacitated, and they needed to be secured there. They did just that. For the time being, they would be safe. Now a signal for help needed to be sent, but the equipment was completely broken. They wouldn't be able to transmit a message outside the base. Even this did not deter Lee Sikwon. He said that there should be communication in the emergency evacuation building, and they would call for help from there. Then Nozomi suggested that they should hurry to the evacuation center. Suddenly, someone knocked on their door and asked if anyone was alive.